Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. We're so glad to have you join us for today's event on cross-sectoral approaches to biodiversity conservation, health, nutrition, and ecosystem services. My name is Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues in the Environmental Change and Security Program, we're pleased to partner with USAID in this first event of a three-part series on lessons learned and entry points for integrating biodiversity conservation, governance, public health, and food security. These are issues that are critically important in the best of times, but the global community has never been more aware than it is today of the interdependencies and deep connections between the health of ecosystems and human health and security. COVID-19 has exposed what many working in development, in conservation, in national security, and in global health have long known: lasting economic prosperity, the health of a population, and the stability of a country cannot be achieved without the sustainable management and protection of that country's wildlife and natural resources. For 5 years, USAID's Biodiversity Results and Integrated Development and Gains Enhanced Project, or BRIDGE, has worked to identify opportunities to better integrate biodiversity conservation into other development initiatives. As we'll hear throughout this series, stronger integration of biodiversity conservation does more than drive conservation outcomes. It improves the impact of broader development objectives like health and nutrition security, political stability, and governance. Before I introduce our opening speaker and moderator for today's discussion, a few logistical notes. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of the session, so if you'd like to submit a question, please send it via email to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, and please do include your name, title, and affiliation. Again, that is ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. The recording of today's event will be available on the event webpage by the end of today or tomorrow morning. That's where you're now watching the live stream. The next two events in the series will be held a week from today on Tuesday, May 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern and Tuesday, May 19th at 9:30 a.m. Those events will also be available on the Wilson Center webpage. Finally, I want to thank our partners at DAI, Bridge Chief of Party, Robin Martino, and Deputy Chief of Party, Jessica Mirabella, for their thought leadership in the development of this series. And now we'll turn to the program. In addition to a stellar panel, we have some introductory remarks and guidance on the conversations from two real leaders in the development sector. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jeff Haney for introductory remarks. Dr. Haney is the Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment at USAID, where he oversees the energy and infrastructure, forest and biodiversity, land and urban, and global climate change offices. Before his current position, Jeff served as the Director for the Office of Energy and Infrastructure and Chief of USAID's Energy Division. He was an energy specialist on the economic policy staff in the Bureau for African Affairs at the State Department and served as an energy advisor in the House of Representatives. Following Jeff's remarks, the mic will go directly to our moderator, Mr. Sean Baker. Sean is the first ever Chief Nutritionist at USAID. In his position, he chairs the agency's Nutrition Leadership Council, oversees the vision and strategy of the agency's Center for Nutrition in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and coordinates related efforts across USAID. Sean has nearly 4 decades of experience in public health, nutrition, and food security. Before joining USAID, Sean was the first director of nutrition at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and spent many years with Helen Keller International, where he was country director in Niger and director and vice president and regional director for Africa. Jeff, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lauren, for the introduction, and thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting the event today, which, as Lauren mentioned, is the first in a series of 3 webinars focusing on different aspects of biodiversity integration with other development sectors. When USAID launched our biodiversity policy 5 years ago, cross-sectoral integration was highlighted as one of the top 2 goals. The approach is grounded in a recognition that human well-being and progress are dependent on the health of biodiverse systems. Or simply put, our collective development objectives will not be achieved if they come at the expense of biodiversity and natural resource management. The ability of societies around the world to develop and thrive is dependent on the health of the forests, fisheries, and natural systems around them. As Lauren mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic highlights the profound connections between human well-being and nature. This is only the latest disease to jump across the evolving and growing interface between humans and our environment. The shrinking separation between humans and wild ecosystems and unregulated wildlife trade and consumption increases the risks for spillover of disease-causing viruses and microbes from animals to people. The integrated approach has been validated by a number of recent studies and reports, including the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, Global Assessment Report. In the words of lead author Sandra Diaz, it is no longer enough to focus just on environmental policy. We need to build biodiversity considerations into trade and infrastructure decisions the way that health and human rights are built into every aspect of social and economic decision-making. Certainly the data in the report is daunting. 75% of the Earth's land, 66% of the marine environment, and 85% of global wetlands have been significantly altered by human actions. 1 million species around the world are threatened with extinction within decades, including 500,000 terrestrial species that do not have enough natural habitat left to ensure their long-term survival. In sum, while people across the globe have access to more food, energy, and raw material than at any point in human history, nature is declining globally at unprecedented rates. This is an unsustainable paradigm with significant future risks to our development gains across sectors. On the bright side, the IPBES report also tells us that it is not too late to make a difference, that nature can still be conserved, restored, and used sustainably, and that this is also key to meeting so many other global goals, such as supporting healthy populations, increasing food security, mitigating climate change, and improving governance outcomes. From the start, USAID realized that integration would not be easy, that it would require dedicated expertise and prolonged engagement. The Bridge project, led by DAI, worked to strengthen the evidence base for biodiversity's role in development and help develop tools and guidance to build sound integrated programs that deliver multiple development outcomes. Collectively, we worked hard to first learn the goals, metrics, and language of each of the target sectors, and to help bring the biodiversity into their tools and enhance their goals, rather than to force a new approach or language on already complex sectors. This work has provided the foundation for a number of recent actions demonstrating USAID's enhanced commitment to integrated programming. Last summer, USAID's administrator launched a new environment and natural resource management framework that lays out an agency-wide blueprint for enhanced integration of natural resource management into all of USAID's development programming. On the programmatic side, USAID recently launched the Health, Ecosystems, and Agriculture for Resilient Thriving Societies, or HEARTH program, focused on attracting private sector partners to advance landscape scale development across biodiversity, food security, governance, and the health sectors. This program has already received support from 8 USAID missions that have pledged up to $60 million to support the most promising partnerships. The response to date has been encouraging, with over 62 concept papers received proposing $376 million in private sector funding that could be mobilized. So while the macro picture remains daunting, we are encouraged by the concrete progress that is being made through enhanced evidence-based, significant partner country demand and interest, private sector enthusiasm, and senior level leadership. We remain convinced that integrating biodiversity conservation with other development efforts produces longer lasting development outcomes. We are thrilled to be joined by today's panel of experts who will focus on the intersection of biodiversity and human health. The issues they will discuss include the dependence of communities on wild fisheries and the relationship between forests and healthy populations. We look forward to the discussion around these critical linkages and their role in supporting long-term and resilient development around the world. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to join others in thanking everyone who's joined here today and thanking the Wilson Center for organizing this. I think this pandemic is really unprecedented in many ways, and one is the way it's impacting every part of our lives, our personal lives for ourselves and our families, the lives of the workforce of the institutions we work for globally, the institutions themselves, which are struggling to maintain operations during this environment, and most importantly, the day-to-day lives of the people we serve. I was on a webinar earlier this morning, and I think one of the major points that came through is, as this pandemic unfolds, we really are learning together, and there's so much we don't know about this pandemic. But one thing we do know is that it's exacerbating pre-existing vulnerabilities. And so all of the work we do collectively to address the needs of the most vulnerable populations is taking on added importance. So in light of this pandemic, I would particularly thank everyone for carving out the time to participate in this webinar, which is exploring exciting interactions between biodiversity and development outcomes. I'm particularly pleased that this is my third month anniversary at USAID in this new role of Chief Nutritionist, and particularly trying to bring together the different aspects of USAID and how they do lead to impacts on nutrition. I'm going to introduce all three of our panelists, but before I do that, I want to remind you that you can submit questions at this email address, ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. Lauren will be collecting all of your questions as we go through the three presentations, and then sending them back to me so I can pose them to the panelists. We're going to start with a series of three presentations, and I will ask a couple of follow-up questions of each of the presenters. And then we'll move to your questions for the presenters. So I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Barbara Best, who was recently with USAID. She was with USAID for 23 years. Unfortunately, she and I did not overlap. She was the Senior Coastal Resources and Policy Advisor, and she led the efforts to integrate wild-caught fisheries management to biodiversity, conservation, and food security strategies, country plans, and activities. Prior to joining USAID, Barbara worked for UC Berkeley, Columbia University, James Cook University in Australia, and Colby College. And she has her PhD from Duke University. After hearing from Barbara, we'll move to Amy Ikowitz. Amy is a senior scientist at the Center for International Forestry Research, or CFOR, where she leads the Sustainable Landscapes and Livelihood team. She is a development and natural resource economist by training, and most of her recent research is multidisciplinary and focuses on the impacts of landscape change on food security and nutrition, and she'll share with us today a very specific case study from Zambia. And then we'll move to Taylor Ricketts, who is the Gund Professor and Director of the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. His recent work is focused on the economic and health benefits provided to people by forests, wetlands, reefs, and other natural areas. He is the co-founder of the Natural Capital Project, a partnership among universities and NGOs to map and value these natural benefits. He's also been an author and editor for 2 UN-sponsored efforts to assess global ecosystems and their contributions to human well-being. So thank you again for participating. I'd like to remind you again to send in your questions to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you, Sean. Let me put my screen on. All right. Well, hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today, albeit virtually. The current pandemic, as people have noted, is just one example of how interconnected human health is with nature. But the response to the pandemic also highlights the importance of having strong health systems in place. And similar to the health sector, agriculture requires resilient systems for food production. And these resilient and nutritious food systems arise when we work with nature and integrate the environmental services it provides, from the provisioning of food, such as fish, to mitigating floods and droughts, and also pollinating many of the nutritious foods. And I'm having trouble advancing the slides in slide when I'm sharing. Okay, there we go. Okay, my presentation today is based upon my work while I was at USAID and had the pleasure of working with the bridge activity. I will focus on fishing today, which involves the collection of wild fish and animals from aquatic habitats, such as ocean, lakes, and rivers. And this is different from aquaculture, or what's called fish farming. Now, why should we focus on fishing and wild-caught fisheries? It's because fishing is one of the largest sources of nutritious food and the largest extractive use of biodiversity, and it is often recognized. In fact, fish is the world's most widely traded food commodity from developing countries, as shown in this FAO figure. The export value of fish from developing countries is greater than the export value of rice, tea, bananas, sugar, and cocoa combined. And fish is primarily traded from developing countries to developed countries, such as the US, EU, Japan, as well as China. But wild-caught fish is not just a source of high-quality protein. It's also an important source of essential nutrients, such as calcium, vitamins A and D, and is oftentimes a better source when compared to other commonly consumed foods, such as chicken, goat, beef, and soybean, and even some farmed fish. Fish is also an important source of omega-3 fatty acid, which is essential for early brain development in children. Overall, it's estimated about 3 billion people depend upon fish, either from fishing or fish farming, for a substantial part of their food security. Yet the contribution of wild-caught fish to human health is at risk. Harvard nutritionist Dr. Christopher Golden and colleagues have found that at least 10% of the global population is at risk to malnutrition from fatty acid and micronutrient deficiencies as fish stocks decline, largely due to poor management. For a million of people living in the tropics, fish adds the missing micronutrients and proteins to what otherwise would be an unbalanced diet. Despite the overwhelming evidence, wild-caught fisheries are often overlooked in international dialogues and international food security programs. So why are fish overlooked? This is the question we wanted to explore with support from the USAID bridge activity and their partner, the Smithsonian Institution. We interviewed people within USAID to understand their perspective on wild-caught fisheries and to identify any knowledge gaps that they may have. Colleagues were interviewed from the Bureau for Food Security, Global Health, Food for Peace, the Resilience Center, and the Center for Democracy, Human Rights and Governance. And their responses fell into three general categories. A large number of those interviewed remarked that they didn't think about wild-caught fisheries at all, and they didn't realize how important they could be. Many responded that they had heard about fish catches that were declining, and they thought that there was nothing that could be done to reverse that decline, and therefore assumed that fish farming was the only solution. And a few people acknowledged that USAID should be doing more on wild-caught fisheries under food security programs, but they really weren't sure how to reverse the fisheries decline. People often remarked that they had seen quite a few abandoned fish ponds in Africa, so acknowledged that aquaculture was only part of the answer. So once we had identified the perceptions and knowledge gaps, Bridge and the Smithsonian Institution gathered evidence to help fill those gaps and also to help dispel any misperceptions that there were. We decided to focus on Africa, given the emphasis on Africa within the USG Food Security Program, but also the needs in Africa. The evidence was synthesized into a report, and then we conducted a series of briefings and seminars and workshops to share the results with USAID staff and their implementing partners. This report and others can be found on the USAID AgriLinks website and the Biodiversity Conservation and Development Gateway website. I also want to note that we developed a 2-page infographic, particularly for those of us who are too busy to read full reports. Page 1 gives the top-level findings from our synthesis, and page 2 may be of particular interest to nutritionists as it compares the nutritional value of commonly landed African fish species and other commonly consumed terrestrial foods. Let me highlight some of the key findings. Fish is an affordable and accessible source of protein for over 400 million Africans and accounts for about 21% of the animal protein consumed on average, and over 50% in some coastal countries. Fish is also an important source of nutrients from calcium, iron, omega-3 fatty acid, zinc, and vitamins A, B12, D, and E. And fish catches in West Africa are 2 to 7 times higher than officially reported previously, indicating that fish consumption per capita may be higher than assumed. Fishing also contributes to livelihoods in Africa. Fishing supports 93% of those involved in the fish sector, while 7% is employed in fish farming or aquaculture. And fishing often involves not only men, but women. About 50% of those in the fish industry are women, primarily engaged in fish processing. Small-scale fisheries are particularly important, supporting up to 25% of the total workforce in some countries. However, the World Bank estimates that Africa could be doing much better. Africa is losing about $10 billion a year in economic benefits due to poor management of the fishing sector, and about 90 billion globally. We found that wild-caught fish are being transported hundreds of miles from where they are caught. This figure illustrates the results from one study that document where different wild-caught fish species are transported, which is often inland through informal trade routes involving women traders. As you can see, fish caught off Senegal can travel as far away as the Congo, and fish from Mali is traded to surrounding countries. Lacking, however, is more up-to-date information on the current status of these informal trade routes as described in this earlier paper, and their contribution to inland household nutrition. Freshwater fisheries are also important sources of local, low-cost, and highly nutritious foods. This figure shows how fish caught in the Great Lakes of Africa are transported to surrounding communities and countries far from their source. Lake Victoria alone provides jobs for over 3 million people, generating $500 billion in annual revenues. Yet the contribution of freshwater and coastal fishing to nutrition and food security is seldom recognized as part of the food system in many development programs. The Nature article by Christopher Golden that I mentioned earlier estimated that 10% of the global population is at risk of micronutrient deficiencies if fish catches are allowed to continue to decline. That risk of malnutrition is especially high in Africa, particularly West Africa countries due to their high reliance on wild-caught fish. The Golden study also emphasizes the need for more nutrition-sensitive fishing and trade policies. Many developing countries prioritize access to fishing for industrial fishers over small-scale fishers, allowing huge quantities of fish to be exported at the expense of local food security and nutrition. Modern management approaches have proven that we can reverse fish decline and improve the natural productivity of wild fisheries, allowing them to rebound. Central to this is engaging fishers in the management process through participatory processes and working with nature through an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management. Other important approaches are similar to those already being applied under the Feed the Future program. We know that secure tenure or access for fishers to fishing grounds and resources can be just as transformational as secure land tenure is for farmers, incentivizing resource stewardship and private sector investments in fishing. And stronger fisher associations and extension services can aid in scaling up best management practices in fishing as in farming. Let me highlight one example of a fishing program that has led to dramatic results. In the Philippines, the USAID EcoFish activity worked with the Department of Agriculture, fishing communities, and fisher associations to improve management over 1.8 million hectares of municipal fishing waters. This led to a 24% increase in fish biomass, a 12% increase in employment benefits, while also enhancing community resilience. And there are similar success stories from around the world, from both developing countries and developed countries. I want to leave you with two key takeaway messages. First, fishing and wild-caught fisheries are just too big to ignore for achieving global food security goals. And this contribution of fishing to nutrition and food security can be enhanced and sustained through improved management and policies. More integrated approaches to food security and nutrition are needed to be adopted that include not only wild-caught fisheries, but also other ecosystem services within broad food system approaches. We need to do a better job assessing and monitoring the contribution of nature-based foods and environmental services. For example, the demographic health surveys could integrate more questions on nature-based foods, and wild-caught fisheries could be incorporated under the Famine Early Warning Network, or FuseNet. Certainly, we need to promote more nutrition-sensitive fishing policies and development work to ensure that local communities have access to nutritious foods. And lastly, we should be measuring and managing food productivity at larger watershed and landscape and seascape scales, integrating aquatic productivity along with terrestrial productivity. So thank you for listening. And once again, please be sure to check out the resources that are available to you on USAID's AgriLinks and the Biodiversity Conservation and Development Gateway.
Thank you, Barbara, for that really rich presentation. I think as a nutritionist, I was always convinced that fisheries were incredibly important. As you've laid out, they're really a nutrient powerhouse. I learned a lot now about also the enormous economic benefits. My first question to you, and we don't have time for a lot of questions right now, is despite the really compelling evidence you laid out, why are we not seeing partner governments and donors doing a better job of integrating wild-caught fisheries and ecosystem services into nutrition and food security programs? What are the constraints to make this happen?
I think there are a couple constraints. One goes back to just sort of a historical legacy. After the 2008-2009 grain crisis, G8 and donor organizations realized the need to increase investments in agriculture. But unfortunately, particularly for the USG response, the focus was on grains and not a broader systems approach, which is what we're seeing FAO, other UN organizations, and even at USAID now talking about. We need to be looking at broader food systems which are embedded within the environmental framework. So I think it's partially a legacy issue, and there have been studies that show how investments in wild-caught fisheries have really declined since 2008, given this shift in emphasis. I think there's great opportunities, though, given the reorganization of the new Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and also this new USAID framework on environmental and natural resources management framework to take a broader approach, which will lead to more resilient and nutritious food systems.
A question follow on, and then I'll pass it on to Amy, of I realized as you were speaking that it seems fisheries suffer that same orphan problem that nutrition does. I don't even know if I go into a country like Senegal, vis-a-vis the government, who is my institutional interlocutor to deal with fisheries issues?
It's a great question. Sometimes fisheries are included within a larger Ministry of Agriculture. And if so, oftentimes they are the orphan department or bureau compared to terrestrial crops. In other cases, West Africa, they do have ministries of fisheries. But then again, even if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the investment by donors, it's usually for the agricultural ministries and not so much the Environment Ministry, or in the case of fisheries, the Fisheries Ministry. So they have been largely left out of this big push for the Sustainable Development Goals investments as well.
Well, thank you, Barbara. We'll come back later because I already see that there are a number of questions coming in for you. But now I'd like to move over to Amy, and we'd like to listen to your presentation.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, great. So, excuse me, I'm gonna share some results from a joint study carried out by the Center for International Forestry Research and FAO in Zambia, trying to quantify the contributions of forests to nutrition through the consumption of wild foods. And I'm gonna focus today mostly on fruit. The main objective of our study was to try to estimate the quantities of wild foods consumed in order to understand how much they contribute to diets across different regions of Zambia. And the larger aim was to try to pilot a strategy or methods that we wanted to show could be successful and then hopefully be taken up by national statistical agencies or forestry departments in different countries, including Zambia, to show that it's not so hard to estimate the quantity of wild forest foods that are collected and consumed. So this was a small study in terms of budget. So we had to choose our sites carefully. And what we decided to do was to go for broad coverage rather than to have a large sample size in one area. So Zambia has 4 different agroecological zones. We tried to select sites in each of the agroecological zones, and in one, if you see the 2 sites, Luingu and Masaiti are in the same agroecological zone. So all in all, we had 5 sites. In each site, we chose a district and within the district, a ward. So those were not randomly sampled, but within each ward, we randomly selected 3 villages, and within each village, randomly selected about 45 households. And in the end, we had a sample of 209 households. We started with a focus group discussion in each site to try to identify the top wild foods that were consumed for each food type that is often collected in the wild. So those were fruits, vegetables, insects, tubers, fish, meat, wild aquatic plants, mushrooms, and nuts. And then we asked the participants within each food type to list the most commonly consumed wild foods within each food type, and then to select out of those the 5 most widely consumed wild foods in that area. And then in the second phase, we administered a survey to female heads of households that had 2 important parts for the purpose of this talk. And one was a 7-day food frequency survey asking the female head of household how many times in the last 7 days she had consumed from a list of foods. And then the second part took the information from the focus group discussions and asked for each of the foods that was listed, that was ranked as the top 5 in the focus group discussion, if she had collected any of those foods, and if so, how much she had collected in the previous year, and out of that, what percentage the household had consumed, as opposed to sold. And so one kind of special feature of the survey was that we also measured the collecting containers of the households. So one common challenge in doing surveys of food, forest food collection, but really even any food consumption, when you're trying to quantify, is that households often report the amounts consumed in non-standardized units. So that can be a real big issue when it comes to trying to quantify wild food collection. So if you see in this picture here, all the way on the left, this is a typical household. Those are the collecting containers that the household uses to collect wild foods. So if we just reported 5 buckets of something, we would have no way later on to know how much a bucket held. So what we did was we asked each of the respondents to bring their household collecting containers to the enumerators, and the enumerators had groundnut shells with 2 calibrated a pitcher and a bucket, and they measured each of the household containers and then recorded the volumes in the survey, so that later on we were able to quantify when the household, first of all, the household was able to respond in their own units, and then we were able to quantify that into a standardized unit. So now I'm going to share with you the preliminary results that we found for fruit. So why focus on fruit? As I'm guessing most of you know, fruits are a very nutrient-rich food group in terms of both micronutrients and phytochemicals. They're also important sources of fiber. Diets low in fruit were found to be the most important dietary risk factor for mortality in a recent Lancet study. And there are very few countries in the world that meet the recommendation of a minimum of 200 grams per person per day of fruit. So fruits are important. So this shows actually all the food types that I mentioned earlier. This shows the percentage of households that collected these foods. And on the bottom, you can see each of the different sites. And if you remember the map, they're pretty widely spread out across the country. And in terms of the fruit collection, in 3 of the sites, 100% of households reported collecting wild fruit, and with the lowest proportion being 90%. So the vast majority of households all collected wild fruit. And green leafy vegetables was like a close second. So this is a summary of some of the results from the 7-day food frequency part of the survey. And the staple food in Zambia is nashima, which is a stiff maize porridge, and that was consumed about twice a day in the last 7 days. And vegetables were pretty widely consumed, very widely consumed actually, frequently consumed. When it came to fruit, the average number of times reported was 2.85 times in the previous 7 days. So if we were thinking of serving sizes of fruits and looking at recommendations, there's different recommendations in different places, but let's say a minimum of recommendations is between 2 and 3 servings per day, which would be about 50. If people were following that, we should see a response something closer to 15. So clearly people are not eating enough fruit. But what's interesting in this context is if you look at the frequency of consumption of domestic fruit versus wild fruit, people reported eating wild fruit on average more than twice the frequency of domestic fruit. So what I just showed you were averages, so that includes people that didn't consume any fruit with people that consumed a lot. So 42% of the women who were surveyed reported not consuming any fruit in the week before the survey, and only 11% had had at least one fruit a day. For the 58% of women who did consume fruit, wild fruit was consumed more than twice as frequently as domestic fruit. So this is 3.4 times versus 1.6. So this is a little bit different than the numbers before, because this is only amongst the women who did consume fruit. Now looking at the quantities, so the 7-day food frequency was obviously just for 7 days, and it was at one point in time, and the wild food quantity part of the survey asks people to look back for the previous whole year. Overall, we found 15 wild fruits were reported consumed, and that's going to necessarily be an underestimate because we only asked about the top 5 foods reported in the focus group discussions. And these are the 3 most widely consumed fruits, and I can't pronounce their Latin names, so I won't try. But here are pictures of those wild fruits, and the first one and the last one are the same, but one's on the tree and one's off the tree. And you can see that those 3 were about half the households across all 5 regions had consumed those 3 fruits. So 97% of what was collected was consumed. So very little of the fruits that were collected were sold. And on average, we found that households consumed 112 kilos of wild fruits. So if we convert that into adult equivalents and we look at it per day, it works out to about 60 grams per person per day of wild fruit. Now, there's going to be we know there's lots of error in our estimate. In some ways, it's likely an underestimate because, as I said, we only asked about the top 5 foods. So in this case would be the top 5 fruits consumed from the focus group discussions, but many households might have collected a bigger range of fruits. And we only asked the female head of household, and lots of households all over the world, but including in Zambia, kids go to the forest and eat a lot of fruit on their own, so that wouldn't be captured by the survey. On the other hand, in some ways it's an overestimate because we didn't account for edible portion size. Oops, sorry. Close your eyes. And how do I go back? Okay. So to summarize, wild fruits in Zambia were collected by almost all households that we surveyed across 15 villages and across all 4 agroecological zones. Wild fruits comprise 68% of the fruits that women consumed in a 7-day period in terms of frequency. They contributed over 25% of recommended daily intake of fruit over 1 year on average. So another way of looking at that is that a typical person in our sample could meet her recommended fruit intake with wild fruit for about 1/3 of the year only eating wild fruit. So as I mentioned before, these are preliminary results. But for the next step in our work is to try to calculate the contributions that these fruits make to recommended nutrient intake for some key nutrients, and we're looking forward to seeing what we find from that. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Amy. I was making a bit of a connection to Barbara's presentation. It was also interesting to see when you look at animal source foods, that in fact fish were more important, more frequent animal source food, almost double of meat. But moving to your very fascinating study, I'm a program person. I deal with what are the practical implications of findings like this? How do you make it relevant to program and policy discussions?
So in many places, especially in developing countries, you hear politicians and policymakers say, yes, we love our forests, we want to conserve them, but in the end, we need to feed our people. So deforestation is often justified in terms of food security, and usually it's for producing staple crops. So what this work in terms of the big picture, I think is showing is that forests themselves are important for food security. So actually, we were surprised ourselves with how much we found for fruit consumption and how wide it was. We weren't expecting to find that big a contribution, but we can see that, especially for such a nutrient-rich food group that's underconsumed, the forests are making a huge contribution. And so, if forests are cleared to grow more maize, yes, people will have more staple crops, but they're going to be losing a lot of micronutrients. And we think it's important to make these contributions visible, because it's not that people don't know. I mean, in Zambia, for example, it's not that people don't know that people eat forest foods. Everybody knows that. It's part of local culture. But without quantifying it, I think it's easy to kind of dismiss it, belittle it a bit, and just not give it the attention it deserves. Once you put a number on it, then the forestry department can say, for example, and people in the forestry department in Zambia actually said this to us, normally when we look at the value of a forest, we look at timber value, because that's a number. If there's no if there's no valuable timber, then that's going to be a candidate for degazetting, usually for food security. So if they have other information that says, wait a second, there's other things that have value in this forest for local people, and have a number, this contributes to food security, this contributes, this percentage of vitamin A or iron, or, we're not at that level yet, but even, I think, 1/3 of people's recommended daily intake of fruit, if we cut that down, where's that fruit going to come from? So,
and I think you're hitting on a recurrent theme here, and I'm going to have to cut you off because I need to move to Taylor. But clearly, if we don't quantify, we don't have an argument. And I think that's something that came out of Barbara's presentation, comes out of yours, and I suspect is going to come out of Taylor's. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Taylor, and we will come back to you with some questions.
Thanks.
So thank you. And Taylor?
Hi, everybody. Let me just share my screen and get set up here. That was fascinating and a great setup, it's true, for the talk that I'm hoping to share. So I'm assuming you can see these slides now. I want to first of all thank the organizers of this online symposium. I've already learned a lot from the first two talks and the intro remarks. What I want to contribute is a global perspective on the relationships between biodiversity and children's health. And this is work that we've been doing in partnership with a bunch of organizations, but very crucially including Bridge as partners in designing and carrying out and communicating what we're learning here. So as people have said, the connections between nature and health are many and really important. Several things like respiratory disease, infectious disease like malaria, and nutrition, as we've just been seeing, are really strongly connected to the state of the natural environment, usually local to communities. And these are some of the diseases that contribute highest to the overall burden of disease globally. They're among the top 5 killers in the developing world. It's also worth noting, when you take a global perspective, that the share of the environmental burden of disease, that's the fraction of the burden of disease globally that can be traced back to environmental causes, that share is not distributed evenly. And like so many things, that environmental burden of disease is disproportionately borne by people in the developing world, especially from this map in Africa. And I think, like many people have pointed out, we don't have to look any further than the COVID pandemic to see how strongly health is linked to ecosystems and the species they contain, and how health problems can be linked to mismanagement of those ecosystems and the species they contain. So that's setting up our work as it has everyone else's on this panel. And I think there's increasing evidence, like you guys were just talking about. We need to measure that. We need numbers in order to have an argument. And I think there's a new global kind of push and interest to provide that evidence. There's several new journals dedicated only to this. Maybe the leading one is Lancet Planetary Health. There are annual meetings now of the Planetary Health Alliance and other things that are sharing what we're learning about the links between ecosystems and human health. I would argue that the majority of that evidence we're accumulating is about local and regional systems and communities, and Amy's was a great example of that, from specific populations in the world and specific ecosystems that they live in. What we want to know is, how general are these relationships? We're accumulating all this evidence. Are there emerging relationships that seem to be true lots of places? And that's important to know so we can figure out how to inform global efforts, especially efforts that internationally operating organizations like, say, USAID might focus on. So again, that's our focus and probably contribution to this panel. We've been for 5 years now investigating the global relationships between nature and human health. And we're doing that with DHS surveys, working in really close partnership with Barbara and others over years on those data. And what we've done is compile with permission as many DHS surveys as we can into one clean database that covers nearly all surveys done by DHS. Now it's almost to 1 million kids in 49 countries. And we know a lot about these children. We've used the childhood surveys to focus on children because they're vulnerable, as we all know, to health and nutrition deficiencies. And we know a lot about these kids now in a global way. We know a lot about their health outcomes, for instance, variables about stunting and diarrhea and their diets, social factors like wealth and education, sanitation factors like where they get their water and what kind of sanitation they have in their households. And we've added to this information from DHS information on natural features like climate and land use, either upstream or nearby. And then watershed condition, again, upstream human activity and forest cover. And I emphasize that because of the first project I'm going to tell you about. Okay, so taking this global look at a variety of health outcomes and how they relate to surrounding ecosystems and their condition. So I'm going to tell you about 2 projects, one in more detail than the second one. And the first one is about watersheds and waterborne diseases. And the main driving question here is, how does watershed condition, which I'll define in a second, affect downstream diarrheal disease among children? So obviously of huge interest, diarrheal disease is the second leading killer of children. About 2,000 a day die, and that's more than AIDS and measles and malaria combined. So it's a big health problem, especially among kids worldwide. Here's just an example of the kind of data we can put together. Here is one survey from Mozambique with about 3,000 households. That's a location, the GPS location of each cluster of households. And we know within the last 2 weeks whether each child in each household has experienced diarrhea, what their water source is. In this case, I'm showing you unimproved water sources, just surface water gathering, and also the condition of the watershed. We can make measurements of how forested and how impacted the watershed upstream of each household is, and that's just indicated here in shades of gray. Okay, so the idea is to connect that watershed condition to diarrhea, taking into account lots of things like water source. I'm just going to jump right to what we found, and this is the work of these 2 fantastic people, Alicia Ellis and Diego Herrera. And this graph's a little complicated, but I'll walk you through it. So each blue square is the effect of each factor on the risk of diarrhea in kids. So if the blue square is to the left of the line, the red line, it decreases the risk of diarrhea. If the blue square is to the right of the line, it increases them. And the whiskers show us the uncertainty. So we can see lots of things like getting old helps, older as a kid helps, being wealthier helps, higher education of your mother, in this case, helps, improved sanitation and water help. But what I want to focus on is what's in the green box. What we found is that human activity, that's population and agriculture upstream, increases the risk of diarrhea in kids, and tree cover upstream, how forested your watershed is, decreases it significantly. So even among all this other stuff going on, things we know affect diarrhea, the condition of the watershed matters. And we see this signal across all these countries, all these various biomes and so forth. We can break this result down just a little bit into urban versus rural. And again, just focus on the green box for a minute. And you can see that the green dots, that is the urban households, when you just look at urban, those effects go away. Those uncertainties cross zero. So we don't see these effects in urban households. We see them strongest in rural ones. Okay. So we can take this model and just play out some potential policy interventions in rural households and just ask what happens if we improved health or education or sanitation versus what happens if we reforested watersheds 10 or 20 or 30%. Those are the three right-hand bars. And we can see that those are all making significant impacts on the change in diarrhea risk among kids. And some of them are on the same order of some of these really traditional or common interventions like improving sanitation, right? So tree cover and managing that is kind of in the game. So I want to put one more wrinkle on this watersheds and diarrhea project. And this is a question that actually arose directly through the partnership with Bridge and USAID people because it's of central interest. And it's a good example of bringing biodiversity issues into sort of ongoing big programs in global development, in this case, WASH. So WASH is water, sanitation, and hygiene. It's the most common way we try to fight diarrhea globally, and we spend billions on it every year. And what we wanted to know, because what Bridge and USAID wanted to know is, can deforestation undermine the gains, the really impressive ones the world has made with WASH? And so a very clever person named Renivo Rosolofsson took this on, and I'm just going to show you the graph right here. What he showed is, so the y-axis, the vertical one, is the impact of improving water source in a household, piped versus non-piped water. So we took thousands of households and matched them in 6 different countries and asked, does piped water improve or reduce the risk of diarrhea in kids? That's that y-axis. And then the horizontal one at the bottom is how forested the watershed is above that household. And what he found is that for really deforested, so down near zero or low forest cover watersheds, the intervention, the WASH intervention, actually didn't have a significant impact. And for high forested watersheds, same, but in those middle regions, he saw an important impact of that intervention. So what he thinks is that if the watershed is too deforested, the water arriving at the household is, or upstream arriving in the cluster is already impaired enough that sources of water won't change that. Whereas on the right-hand side, a really highly forested watershed may not require additional infrastructure at the household. But in that middle ground, these WASH impacts have their highest effect. And that's really important to know when rolling out WASH interventions. Okay, so I just want to really quickly talk about forests and diet diversity. This question is about how does nearby forest affect diet diversity in children? And again, this same guy, Renivo, just took from our data set households near forest, that is within 3 kilometers, and households outside of or far from forest beyond 8 kilometers, and compared them for their diet diversity. He did this in 27 countries, 43,000 households, and did the statistical matching technique to pick households that otherwise were really similar. And what he found was a significant increase in diet diversity for families that live near forest versus far from forest, really similar to what Amy was showing. And the one to zero in on is the matching row, that third one, showing a 16% increase in diet diversity, which is just a count of the number of different types of foods that a household consumes. It's a really standard way of simply coming up with the diversity of a diet. So 16% improvement in near forest compared to far. And all the other stuff on this graph is just really testing whether that's a robust estimate. And it is a really, really robust estimate. Even though these are big, observation data, we're pretty confident that the forest is causing this change. And it could be because of forest foods, like Amy was talking about. It could be because households are getting other things from forest, non-timber forest products that they can sell. It could be actually a function of mothers' time in traveling to forest for things like firewood and charcoal. So various mechanisms that could be behind this. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide because I think time is running short. So I want to get to the take-homes really quickly. So first of all, what we're learning from this and about 6 other studies we've done with these DHS data, many of which in collaboration with Bridge, is that forest and conservation can affect children's health. Even after controlling for lots of other things we know affect children's health, we still find a signal of forests on health outcomes. And we find that those forest effects can interact with traditional interventions like WASH, and we found that other ways as well. The second take home is that the signal is strongest for the most vulnerable kids. And this is the thing that interests me, maybe the most of all. Again and again, we find that rural and poor households depend more directly on nature than their converse. And so there's an enormous equity issue here in terms of conserving nature for human health. Lastly, nature investments can be public health investments as a result of those first 2 points. I think it's a really important complement to traditional interventions. I don't think investing in forests should replace traditional things we're doing to improve human health worldwide, but it's a great complement. And I think that signals a lot of synergy among conservation and health and development sectors that have often operated separately. So the last thing I want to say is just about the Sustainable Development Goals, back to the biggest picture. The SDGs are guiding global investments all over the world in development. But it's absolutely clear that we won't succeed unless we find synergies in them and advance many of them at once. And I think health and forest is a good example of projects that can advance poverty goals, health goals, and the nature goals all at once. These are the 6 SDGs that are just found in just the talk I gave in the last 15 minutes. So with that, I'll say thanks to all of these people, particular thanks to USAID and Bridge for being really great partners in this work. And I'm looking forward to discussing it further with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Taylor. We have used up your 15 minutes, but one of the fun things of being the moderator is not just that I get to learn so much during this, but then I get to ask questions also. But before I ask a follow-up question, I do want to remind everybody online that if you do have questions, please send an email to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. And I see some emails coming across my chat box, which I'll be asking you as we open up to broader discussion. But I find it fascinating juxtaposing Amy's presentation, this really looking in depth at specific communities who are living off forests, with this global picture that you presented, Taylor. And just to push you on, I think, your last point of how do studies like this translate into policy discussions, financial allocation discussions at a country level. And just to push it I mean, if I'm a finance minister, I might say, okay, well, I'm going to cut the health budget and increase the forestry budget. I don't think that's what you want to have as an outcome, but how do you use this very compelling information to actually impact the way policies are created and financial resources, which are very constrained, are allocated? And you're on mute there. I'm sure you have a great answer, but you're on mute.
Thank you. So I'll just make 2 points in response to that. It's a really great question and the one that we think about all the time. First of all is, I think, I love that Amy's talk and mine went back to back, because I think we're going to need work at both of those levels. The role I think that these global syntheses play is that it's kind of generalizing from some of these site or country or region or state specific studies so that we don't maybe have to do a study like Amy's every place we might want to make this point or intervene. We just don't have enough money or time to do in-depth field level work everywhere that is important to do. So syntheses can make predictions that this is likely to be the case even if we haven't done a study in a particular place. And that removes this argument that, you know, we don't know if that's true here yet. That was a study over there in Zambia. That's not the same case here. So I think there's a really good 1-2 that can happen between local, detailed, careful field studies like Amy's and these syntheses that continue to show that we're finding this in a general way. Secondly, I think that finance minister or the government generally, I think at the very least, can make sure that the Minister of Health and the Minister of Forests or Environment or something are coordinating and not undoing each other's work. At the very least, a realization that their missions are tied to each other and dependent on each other can reduce kind of the silo effect and make sure that at least there's not this antagonistic work that's not intended between them. I also think I would focus on the health minister and make sure it's clear that investments in forests and conservation and biodiversity can actually be legitimate investments in public health, that could be among the tools they use, not just someone else's job, but among the tools they use to combat public health. And again, nothing could have made that more clear than the pandemic we are currently in. The costs, the global costs of dealing with this pandemic will dwarf by millions of times the cost of managing ecosystems to reduce the likelihood of pandemics like this. So it is a legitimate and cost-effective public health investment that should be thought about among other ones.
Thank you very much. Again, we're getting a number of questions over email. If you still have questions, please send them to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. The first question that came in was for Barbara. It's actually two questions, but I'll only give you one of them. Ben Wandago from USAID Nairobi asked about, did you explore the role of indigenous knowledge on choice of fish species and their nutritional values?
It's an interesting question, but for our project, we just relied on existing information. And so the synthesis involved scanning for the information that was clearly available. We didn't get that fine granularity, which is really needed when you start working at the country level. But clearly you would need to look at what are the communities currently using and their traditional knowledge on that fishery.
I'll mute myself. Yes, thank you. I wanted to go to a question for Amy. I need to find it now, excuse me. This comes from Jeffrey Blake, Climate Change Program Specialist at USAID's E3 Bureau. One of the questions, there are two questions. How far do people have to travel to collect wild fruit, and has this distance increased over the past year? And then did people indicate whether their reliance on wild fruits changed during periods of drought, flood, or other climate stresses?
Thanks for those great questions. Unfortunately, we for our survey, we reduced the questions several times, and at one point we had the question actually about distance and perceived changes, and we actually threw out those questions along with many other interesting questions because we committed to not have our survey go over 45 minutes so as to not take up too much of people's times, and really focused on trying to get really good answers to the few questions that we asked. So anecdotally, from being in many of the communities, the distance is not that far. So I would say from between one and 4 to 5 kilometers, but it depends also on your definition of a forest, because a lot of times people collect foods from forest patches that wouldn't really be considered forests. And so that was in part why we ended up reducing some of our questions, because the definitions of these things get tricky and then take a lot of time for follow-up. I can't hear you, Sean. Your mic is muted.
Yes, thank you for that. I'll ask a follow-up question, because it's one thing that struck me in Barbara's presentation was how important wild fisheries are to women's livelihoods. And one thing I wanted to understand from your study, if you had any insights to those household dynamics of who's actually doing the collection, and then those resources that are being collected, who controls those resources?
Yeah, so for the different food types that I had listed in the thing, we looked at 9 different types of foods, and women were the primary collectors of 7 of those, including the fruits. For meat, which is illegal, hunting is illegal in Zambia, unless you have a special license, and those are beyond most people's means to be able to afford. But people still do hunt. Men do most of the hunting, and fishing depends on the community. In some communities, both men and women fish. In other communities, it's only men who fish. And in terms of who controls the resources, we didn't ask that level of detail in our questions, but from my experience in working in other places in similar types of surveys, oftentimes if things are not commercialized, so if foods are collected for household consumption, then it's often women, for food in particular, it's often women who then control the food. Once things become commercialized and sold, then it really depends on culture. So, and by the way, I didn't mention, but the sites that we have had many different ethnic groups. So some communities were diverse ethnically, and other communities were not, but they were in different parts of the country. So it probably wouldn't have been uniform in our city either.
Thank you. I have a question for Taylor that comes from Jessica Stevens with USAID. The question is really for the sort of research that actually we've been talking about for all 3 panels, but then your research specifically. It really requires expertise across disciplines, and it's key to train professionals in multidisciplinary topics. And how are institutions integrating these opportunities in higher learning? What efforts are made to minimize barriers to entry in the professional settings to allow cross-sector transitions?
Yeah, so I think what that question is about is how might we be training people to do these kind of interdisciplinary work that is so relevant to the cross-cutting problems we're facing? Is that a good restatement of that?
Yes, and then yeah. I think it's not just how do you train them, but then how do they have a career path?
Yeah.
When often institutions, certainly government ministries, are very siloed by nature. You might train people in a cross-disciplinary fashion, but then how do they actually have a career path? So I think it's important.
Yeah, I think those are kind of the 2 steps. On the training side, training programs, universities have not been helping traditionally. They are now, but traditionally they haven't been helping, because you're getting, a PhD or a master's in a very narrow field. You get deep expertise in one thing, and that kind of sets you up to get a job in that same kind of narrow path on the way forward. I think universities are changing quite rapidly in this way. So the institute that I work at the University of Vermont is a great example of that. It is just emphatically interdisciplinary and gives out fellowships for PhD students and young researchers to do interdisciplinary work only. That's kind of our contribution, is to try to train people to think about the connections across a whole system, even if they are in a job eventually at a Ministry of Finance or environment only. They can think in ways that make these connections. I think secondly, it's kind of like the answer I gave before. Evidence like this, I think, helps traditionally siloed organizations think about and understand these connections. Crises like the one we're all living in right now help do that as well. I think one of our graduates whose face was on my talk, Diego Herrera, is a good example. He came through the Gun Institute, then worked at Environmental Defense Fund for a bunch of years, and now works at the World Bank on their ecosystem services group. So I think those two steps I just talked about can help. If we're training people to think this way, they themselves can help start changing the institutions that they go on and work at.
Thank you for that. I wanted to push on that more, but before that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara because there are a few questions for you. But I'm going to try to triage down to one. The one question that comes from Robin Abel, freshwater lead at Conservation International. You said that studies have shown investments in wild-caught fisheries have decreased since 2008. Could you share any additional information? But I think more importantly, reflect on how do we reverse that trend? So build on what you had already said about why you think that's happened, and then how do we reverse that trend?
Yes, I'd be glad to do that. What we've seen and what has been reported, if you look at funding from the donors, particularly to SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 2, for fisheries, that has drastically decreased because there's been a big emphasis on terrestrial crops. And part of that is, as I mentioned, historical legacy, and also the way how responses to the grain crisis of 2008 really took a very narrow view, and we need to do a broader systems approach. On the other hand, what she may be referring to, there are some foundations which have come in and increased their contributions to ocean marine conservation. And the point I want to make is that funding for food security programs oftentimes have a very different stated goal than that for conservation. And we need to bring those groups together to really look at how do we have systems across those that can be more robust and resilient over time. I want to go back to also a question that was posed to Amy about the role of women. It's just not in processing. Same as in the forest, women who live along coast or rivers or lakes oftentimes are going out and collecting wild animals and plants from aquatic systems. It's called gleaning. And that the role of that really has not been studied well, and how that contributes to the health and nutrition of families.
No, thank you, Barbara, for bringing that up. And Amy, it's also why I pushed on that issue, is that what we do see consistently in nutrition is that if women have better control of resources, that almost always translates into better utilization of or optimizing the utilization of those resources to meet family dietary needs and health and education needs. So I think that's why I'm struck of the other angle here is the extent to which these natural resources are, at least women have better control over them. That's likely to amplify the positive impacts on development outcomes, certainly on nutritional status. And I think it's a common theme we're seeing here. Barbara, since I have you, there was a question on not just fisheries, but another question from Rosario Galvin of, is algae farming considered alongside fish farming or synergies? And what role does algae farming play in sustainable systems?
Well, that gets to the big question about wild foods versus either seafood or algae farming. It can play a role in some cases, but once again, it's just not the act of fish farming or seaweed farming. It's how is that being governed, and particularly how are the impacts, potential impacts on the wild system being mitigated. There's a big focus on algae farming because of the carrageenan, the demand. And yet some algae species we know can be very detrimental, say, to coral reefs. They can smother the corals. And so we need to look at these broader impacts, not just on whether one activity is increasing. And that gets into the need for a broader management and governance of these farming or seaweed farming, as well as the fisheries. How are those systems connected, and how do we mitigate the impacts from farming on the wild populations?
Thank you. There's a really interesting question, a very timely question that's come across from Wai Zhang, the Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI. And I actually like to have a rapid fire response from each of the three of you. So I'm going to start with Taylor, move to Amy, and then go to Barbara. And the question is, as the COVID pandemic unfolds, there have been voices that push back against wild food harvest, which is believed to increase risk of zoonotic disease emergence. How would you respond to this possible wave of arguments against human collection and consumption of food from nature to ensure that our progress in preserving biodiversity for food nutrition health is not undermined? So Taylor, in 1 minute or less.
It's the big question, right? It's going to be one of the main preventative activities we can take to prevent global pandemics like this. It's a really thorny question because a lot of livelihoods are based, as we've been showing, on wild-caught foods, including wild-caught meat, legal or illegal. To me, I think there are a variety of ways that we encroach on the forests and habitats of wild species that might transmit viruses and jump to us. Subsistence wild meat harvest might be the one that I worry about least. I think there's pet trade. I think there is harvest and hunting for markets for kind of specialty items. I think there's a lot of ways in which we bring ourselves into really close contact with living and dead wild animals that don't have much to do with fundamental livelihoods. They're more luxury goods. And those are the things we should get after first. And be really clear about what the health and economic trade-offs of any of those segments of the wildlife trade market are. But again, I think we can do a lot of good by addressing some of the other ways we come into contact with those species, not only, or not first, for sure, the kind of subsistence hunting of food.
Thank you. Amy, 1 minute.
I could talk about this for an hour. So I guess from my thing to see it is that it's just one of many different types of food that are collected from forests. And many of these make very important contributions to people's diets. But that said, wild meat does contribute in many countries to many poor communities that don't have access to animals for foods. Wild meat can be super important nutritionally for communities. And domesticated livestock can also be a source of diseases. So I don't think it's so simple. And I don't think that communities, let's say in Zambia, well, in Zambia it's illegal to hunt anyway, but let's say communities in Cameroon should have their main source of animal protein banned because of something that we still don't really quite understand so well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Barbara, and then I need to wrap up and give a few words of a few follow-up points.
Okay, first I want to clarify that even though people talk about the COVID starting in the seafood market in Wuhan, the seafood was not associated with the pandemic. We have to recognize that most of these potential risks come from mammalian species, not other types of species. And as Amy pointed out, There are domesticated species like pigs, which can also be involved in this. So a greater understanding of which are those key species, particularly bats and even pigs, which pose the greatest risk, and how do we do better management of those? Clearly, as I saw a cute cartoon, we should not be eating bats, for one. And so understanding what are the real risk factors and which are the real species at risk. And then having investments which can allow us to monitor for those risks are important. So we have this, what's called the One Health approach, understanding how environmental and human health interact, and we can keep good monitoring of that system. So eat seafood, don't eat bats.
I like that. I think that could be a common theme. I have the challenging task of making a few wrap-up comments, which I'll try to do, and then giving some instructions for some of the further events in this series. But before I do that, I really a heartfelt thanks to all panelists. On a selfish point of view, this has been incredibly enriching for me since I've learned so much from this. Thanks to the Wilson Center for organizing, and thanks most especially to everybody who's tuned in now. As I listened to this, I think I came up with 8 themes. One theme is around fragility and resilience. One theme is around orphan. One theme is around making the invisible visible. Another is around food security, which is an existential priority. There is a recurring theme about indigenous knowledge, a theme around vulnerability and equity, a theme around complementarity, and then I think this last theme we're closing on, which is what I've called evidence-based trade-offs. Now, let me build on them. I think this crisis has just illustrated how fragile our food systems are, environmental systems, and that we've got to be focused on how do we build more resilience into these systems that can be so hit so hard by any crisis. The orphan, I think, in all of these is that the institutional arrangements are not set up well to actually engage the policy dialogues and make the right policy and investment decisions to address these issues. And so we need to be able to work across institutional structures more effectively. I think in all cases, it was very clear that we're not going to get a place at the table. If biodiversity is just seen as this one fuzzy, nice to do thing, you got to measure just how important this is on the impacts to human health, human nutrition, human livelihoods. And we need to, that measurement agenda is so critical. And that's where I immediately go to the food security. I think all national leaders in almost any country I've worked in, food security is an existential issue. And unless we can link up the evidence to why these are contributions to food security, we're probably not going to get a place at the table. I was very struck, and I think, Barbara, you said this, or I think or both Barbara and Amy, is that, in fact, there is incredible indigenous knowledge about the importance of wild sources of food for livelihoods, but that's not often been translated into quote unquote modern knowledge that is documented, that is quantified. And so how do we actually build that indigenous knowledge base so it has a place at the policy table? I really liked, Taylor, as I pushed on you, the complementarity of how we're not fighting for necessarily resources, but how do we make sure that we come up with some unusual suspects of allies, of health ministers can be allies of arguing for the investments in forestries, for example, or agriculture ministers, health ministers can be allies in arguing for investments in wild source and wild fisheries. And then the evidence-based, that really, these are difficult trade-off discussions, and unless we have a good evidence base, we're not going to inform policies that are based on evidence. They're going to be based on conjecture. In my closing remarks, my instructions, and then Lauren, you'll step in here to see if I did something wrong. This event has been recorded and will be available on the Wilson Center event page by the end of the day today or tomorrow morning at the latest. Holding Lauren accountable for that, not me. There are going to be 2 additional events. This is the first of this series. The next is next Tuesday, the 12th, and then there will be one, not next Tuesday, and then the other Tuesday, the 19th.
That's correct.
That's correct. And then there's also going to be a summary of today's event will be available on the blog New Security Beat.
That's right. Thank you.
So Lauren, over to you. What have I missed?
No, you caught it all. Thank you so much. I want to extend my gratitude to all of the panelists, to Jeff Haney for the opening remarks, and to Sean, thank you for being such an amazing moderator. And thank you to everybody tuning in online. We really appreciate your flexibility and adaptability in this strange time, and hope you all stay well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.